Listen carefully because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive paper, breath, or conscience. On a cold night in 1858, a powerful man bet his unborn blood on the obedience of chains and lost control of something far older than himself. This isn't a story about cruelty alone. It's about how systems train men to believe they are gods over flesh, and what happens when that illusion finally fractures. I'm not here to shock you. I'm here to walk you into a sealed room history tried to brick over, and once you step inside, you won't walk out the same. In the antebellum South, power did not announce itself with violence. Violence was just the currency. Power wore church clothes. Power signed ledgers. Power shook hands and called itself civilization. The men who owned land and lives believed the world was a board and every soul on it a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or erased. And they believed this so deeply, so completely, that they turned domination into sport. There were nights when the gentlemen of Mississippi gathered not to pray or deliberate justice, but to gamble on human breaking points. Not metaphorical ones, real minds, real bodies, real despair. They wagered on who would endure, who would collapse, who would vanish without leaving a stain on the white columns of their reputations. And because the system rewarded silence, it worked. For decades, at the center of this particular darkness stood a colonel decorated, respected, rotting from the inside. A man who had learned that honor was a sound you made, not a thing you practiced. He had traded truth for status so many times he no longer knew the difference. Debts pressed in on him, not just financial, but moral, though only one of those kept him awake at night. So when offered a wager that would erase his losses at the cost of his own lineage, he did not see a daughter. He saw collateral. You need to understand this clearly. Monsters don't begin as beasts. They begin as men who are rewarded for shutting off parts of themselves. Institutions teach them how. Tradition blesses them. Silence protects them. Until one night, the game stops obeying the rules. What happened next wasn't just a crime. It was a collapse, a fault line opening beneath an entire order of control. And the reason this story matters now is because the mechanics never disappeared. They just learned new names. Stay with me. What you're about to descend into isn't history, it's a blueprint. By the time November 14th arrived, Rosewood Hall was already humming with anticipation, the kind that smells faintly of bourbon, fear, and old wood. Curtains had been drawn over the chapel windows. Every hinge oiled, every floorboard examined. It was to be perfect in every way, because the colonel's creditors and his enemies believed in precision. And precision, they thought, was control. Elizabeth Fairmont, 5 months pregnant and 24 years old, walked the grounds like a ghost wearing her own skin. To anyone observing, she was the obedient daughter, the fragile heiress, the piece in a larger game. But she was far from fragile. Every step she took was a calculation. Every glance toward the darkening trees was a measurement of risk. She had been watching her father, studying the patterns of those who ruled her life. And for the first time, she would turn that observation into action. The 4 men who were supposed to be instruments of obedience, Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac, stood outside the chapel. Skilled, patient, restrained. Men who had learned to survive by masking their power. To the colonel, they were tools. To history, they became agents of their own unspoken justice. Each had suffered, each had lost, each had been catalogued by the system as trustworthy enough to obey. None of them trusted him, none of them feared him, not truly. And yet, for the colonel, the wager felt invincible. He had signed the contract, witnessed, verified. Everything was under the illusion of legality and order. $47,000 could be erased if this night went exactly as he intended. The stakes were real. The risk was personal. But the night had a different design. You see, when you try to commodify a soul, when you turn a human being into currency, the very act of control invites chaos. The universe has a way of unbalancing arrogance. And this night would prove it in a way the colonel could never have foreseen. Inside the chapel, Elizabeth felt the weight of centuries of imposed silence, the whisper of ancestors, the shadow of her mother, the echo of every life treated as property. And yet, there was power in that weight. power in knowing what no one else dared to see. She knew she was being offered as a bet, a symbol, a lesson, but she also knew that she had resources the colonel could not measure. Wit, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception itself. Outside, the wind whispered secrets that only the observant could hear. Chains rattle, hooves stir, candles flicker. The stage was set and the actors were moving. But in the silent tension, one truth had already become clear. No ledger, no bet, no institution could contain what was about to unfold inside that small, locked room. If you feel the pull of this night, comment, "The clock ticks twice," and again, "The clock ticks twice" below. Let it anchor you. Let it mark your awareness. This isn't a casual story anymore. You're standing at the threshold. Once you pass, everything you thought about power, control, and history will shift. The chapel doors closed behind Elizabeth with a weight that felt heavier than iron. Outside, the wind carried the distant clatter of horses, the soft murmur of servants, and the faint, expectant laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. Inside, she faced the 4 men: Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac. Each carried the imprint of suffering, but also a restraint born of survival, a restraint that could snap with one calculated choice. She looked at them, her eyes unflinching. In that moment, they were no longer enslaved men in the ledger of her father's life. They were co-conspirators in a new, unspoken equation. The power of the oppressed when fully conscious of the game being played. Each of them understood the stakes. Each of them understood the ritualized theater that had been prepared for them. But none of them had expected what Elizabeth had brought into the room. Awareness. She spoke softly, almost too quiet to be heard beyond her own breath. Words that carried more weight than chains, more force than fists. "We are in their theater," she said. "They believe they direct the story, but we are the ones who decide the ending." In that single sentence, centuries of learned helplessness began to fracture. Their gazes met hers not with fear, but with recognition. This was no longer survival. This was strategy. History often forgets the moments when power shifts quietly, invisibly, before it erupts into visible change. What happened in that chapel was not a rebellion in the traditional sense. There were no swords drawn, no immediate violence, but the psychological stakes were higher than any battlefield. Elizabeth understood what every powerful man fears: the realization that control is an illusion, that a single misjudgment could unravel the meticulously constructed hierarchy they relied on. Time in that room seemed elastic. Minutes stretched into hours. The colonel's carefully designed wager had assumed compliance, but Elizabeth and the 4 men refused the parameters imposed upon them. Every glance, every movement, every choice became a negotiation of dominance. Who truly held power? The answer was no longer a ledger entry. The answer was in consciousness, in awareness, in the refusal to be objectified. Outside, the plantation slept under a veneer of order, ignorant of the quiet subversion unfolding within. The system had never trained men to calculate beyond obedience. But Elizabeth and the 4 had done exactly that. They understood the leverage of perception, the psychology of fear, the rhythm of control. And as the night deepened, it became clear that no contract, no bet, no societal expectation could dictate what would emerge. And so the night continued tense, silent, pregnant with possibility. By sunrise, everything would change. Identities, alliances, and the understanding of power itself. Those who believed themselves in control would learn a brutal truth. The most dangerous thing a man or a woman can wield is awareness in a world designed to suppress it. Comment now if you feel the shift. The clock ticks twice. Again, the clock ticks twice. Let it mark your initiation into seeing what others refuse to see. This is not a story. This is a revelation. The hours crawled inside that chapel like shadows stretching toward something inevitable. Elizabeth could feel the pulse of the night, the rhythm of fear and anticipation that the colonel and his society had meticulously cultivated. But fear, she had learned, could be redirected, and so she turned it into a weapon. The 4 men observed her quietly at first, their training insisting on restraint. Samuel's hands, usually steady with tools, trembled slightly as he calculated his moves. Joshua's eyes, forged in grief and labor, scanned the room for weaknesses, seeking patterns no one else could see. Marcus, calm and precise, measured every breath, every shift of light on the curtains. Isaac, the preacher, spoke no words yet carried authority in the stillness, a reminder that leadership does not require titles, only presence. Elizabeth broke the silence with a voice sharp as a whip, yet smooth as bourbon. You are not instruments. You are participants. Do you understand the game? Or are you still playing the part they wrote for you? The words landed like stones in a pond, rippling through their resolve. It was then that the dynamics of power began to bend. The colonel's wager assumed compliance, but what he could never account for was self-possession. Awareness, the refusal to be catalogued. Outside the chapel, the plantation breathed under the cold Mississippi sky, unaware that the pillars of control, the white columns, the ledger books, the societal rituals were quietly collapsing. Control, it turned out, was never in the hands of those who thought they had it. It was in the minds of the aware, in the understanding of leverage, in the subtle defiance that cannot be named or punished until it manifests as undeniable action. Elizabeth moved deliberately, every gesture calculated. She drew on everything she had learned from hidden journals, whispered histories, and the intuition inherited from generations forced into silence. She understood that the colonel believed he had orchestrated inevitability, but inevitability only exists for those who fail to observe the variables: human will, perception, and the unpredictable spark of rebellion. The chapel was a theater, but the script had been rewritten. The four men recognized it, too. The night transformed from a test of obedience into a crucible of strategy. Every choice, every glance, every word became a weapon of psychological warfare. The colonel's fantasy of dominance had no place here. What emerged instead was the raw mechanics of empowerment. The knowledge that even in captivity, the mind remains sovereign. By midnight, the room had shifted. The wager no longer defined them. The colonel's intentions had become irrelevant. They were architects of their own outcome, and each of them sensed that when dawn came, nothing would be the same, not the plantation, not the families, not the ledger, and certainly not the perception of who truly wielded power. And remember, if you've followed this far, comment, "The clock ticks twice." Twice. Let it anchor you in the awareness that control is never what it seems. The deeper the descent, the stronger the awakening. Dawn approached slowly, bleeding pale light through the chapel's heavy curtains. Every hour that passed had sharpened the edges of power, revealing the fault lines in the colonel's design. What was meant to be a night of submission had become a labyrinth of awareness, a chess game where the pieces had learned the moves the master did not know existed. Elizabeth sat quietly, feeling the life within her, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Her body, her child, had been considered collateral, a wager for debts, a tool for entertainment. And yet, that same body became her instrument of strategy. The four men, her unexpected allies in this unspoken war, moved with precision, no longer acting as the obedient, invisible laborers the colonel had believed them to be. They were no longer constrained by fear. They were liberated by choice. The psychology of control is subtle. Most men assume that authority comes from power over others. But the true command lies in understanding the observer. In the chapel, Elizabeth and the four men had become the observers. Every detail mattered. The tick of the clock, the faint creak of floorboards, the rhythm of someone breathing too heavily outside. In these details, they discovered leverage. And leverage, once discovered, cannot be ignored. History records obedience. It rarely records subtle defiance. But defiance can be more devastating than overt rebellion. The colonel's society had built their power on predictable patterns: fear, shame, coercion. Yet predictability is a trap. Awareness, calculation, and the willingness to act in silence break that trap in ways no ledger, no law, no social contract can repair. By midnight, the narrative had shifted entirely. By dawn, the consequences would be irreversible. Elizabeth's mind worked like a clockwork mechanism. She knew exactly what needed to be done. The men were not her captors, they were her instruments, yes, but instruments with agency. Each one had the capacity to act at the precise moment when the illusion of control would snap. She had turned the colonel's own wager into a mirror, reflecting back the truth he refused to see. Control is never given. It is assumed. And when assumed without respect for the human mind, it becomes a liability. Outside, the plantation stirred with false normalcy, unaware that its foundations were cracking. By the time the first light touched the chapel, what emerged would not be the product of obedience, but of consciousness, strategy, and unacknowledged power. The colonel had thought he could reduce life to a ledger, but life is always more cunning, more unpredictable, and infinitely more dangerous than the illusions of those who believe themselves masters. This is your moment to remember. Comment, the clock ticks twice. And again, the clock ticks twice. Let it anchor your awareness. What unfolds next is not just history, it is the anatomy of power being rewritten before your eyes. The descent grows darker, and only those who observe will survive its revelations. By the first pale light of morning, the chapel had become a crucible. Silence reigned, but it was not the silence of obedience, it was the silence of minds fully awake. Elizabeth and the four men had rewritten the rules without a single strike of violence. The colonel, who had imagined absolute control, had underestimated something fundamental. That awareness alone can dismantle a system more thoroughly than any rebellion. The four men moved with quiet precision, carrying the weight of generations who had been catalogued, commodified, and dismissed. Samuel, once just a carpenter, now held the blueprint of strategy in his mind. Joshua, whose grief had been invisible, became the keeper of timing, the one who could anticipate every potential betrayal. Marcus, silent and measured, became the executor of decisions no one else could trust to make. Isaac, the preacher, understood the moral gravity. He wielded the ethical weapon of truth in a room built entirely on lies. Elizabeth, for her part, had transformed from pawn to orchestrator. Her intellect and intuition became instruments sharper than any sword, capable of cutting through centuries of imposed authority. She had learned from observation, from journals hidden beneath floorboards, from the whispered guidance of women like Clara, who had understood the mechanics of survival long before her. Power is always transmitted in silence first, before it is ever wielded in plain sight. Outside the chapel, the plantation continued its pretense of order. The white columns gleamed under the weak sun, the fields stretched in geometrical perfection. The ledger of debts and bets lay ready for the next hand of domination. But inside the chapel, a new order had emerged. The wager, the colonel's grand design, was no longer a question of compliance. It had become a testament to the fragility of control, to the inevitability of resistance whenever consciousness awakens. History is rarely kind to those who awaken too early. It buries the details, censors the witnesses, rewrites the records. But in this case, traces survived. A sealed letter, whispered testimony, and the echoes of a night where the illusion of control collided with human cunning. By the time the chapel doors reopened, the colonel believed he still commanded the narrative. Yet reality had already shifted. The ledger of obedience had failed, replaced by a ledger of awareness and calculated action. This moment is crucial for you listening now. The night inside the chapel teaches a dangerous truth. Authority relies on assumption, not fact. When awareness enters, the foundations crumble quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. Do not underestimate the power of perception, strategy, and presence. It is the most potent weapon of all, and the colonel, for all his wealth and influence, had never learned to measure it. The descent deepens here. Hold your attention. Let your understanding sharpen. And remember, comment once more, the clock ticks twice. And again, the clock ticks twice. Seal your awareness. You are now part of the lineage of observers, those who see the machinery behind the mask. When the first weak sunbeams struck the chapel windows, the tableau inside was no longer what the colonel or history expected. Elizabeth and the four men stood together, yet apart, each a conscious participant in the dismantling of a system designed to erase them. They had learned what power truly is. Not the ability to command, but the ability to remain unseen until the moment when the illusion of control collapses under its own weight. The colonel, pacing outside, believed he still dictated fate. He had counted on fear, obedience, and societal ritual to guarantee compliance. But the wager was already lost not because of violence or resistance, but because his assumptions were flawed. Control, he learned too late, is never in possession. It is perception. It is the acknowledgement of agency. And once agency awakens, no ledger, no threat, no social contract can contain it. Inside, Elizabeth traced her fingers along the grain of the chapel's wooden pews, memorizing the patterns of light and shadow. She was aware of every detail: the hinges, the curtains, the locks. These were the tools of domination, but they had become her instruments. Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac mirrored her focus. They had understood the wager not as a trap, but as a lens into the weaknesses of the system that oppressed them. Together, they had transformed a night of terror into a demonstration of strategic mastery. History rarely credits those who manipulate systems from within. The colonel's society would record only outcomes, never the quiet battles of the mind. But the night at Rosewood Hall became a crucible where the mechanics of power, control, and psychological dominance were exposed, refined, and inverted. The enslaved, the pawn, the supposedly powerless, they had learned the calculus of influence. And in their silence, they now held dominion over those who thought themselves untouchable. By mid-morning, the world outside remained ignorant. The fields, the house, the ledger books, everything seemed intact. Yet the invisible architecture had been compromised. The colonel's name, the debt, the wager, they were mere shadows in a structure whose foundation had been quietly shattered. And this is a lesson not just from history, but for anyone who believes that force or authority is permanent. Permanence exists only in perception. Awareness is the true disruptor. Take this truth with you. Observe. Measure. Understand that control is always a fragile illusion, and that the moment it meets strategy, cunning, and consciousness, it fractures. The chapel at Rosewood Hall did not just witness a night of terror, it witnessed the birth of power in those who had been denied it for centuries. Now hold fast. Let this knowledge settle. The final descent approaches, and the truths revealed will be irreversible. You are witnessing not just a story, but the anatomy of human mastery over systems designed to suppress it. The line between pawn and strategist has been crossed, and there is no turning back. By the time the sun fully rose over Rosewood Hall, the night's events had already rewritten the fates of those involved. Elizabeth emerged from the chapel not as a victim, but as a calculated force. The four men stepped out with a quiet authority that belied their labels. No ledger, no wager, no plantation hierarchy could define them anymore. They had reclaimed what was never theirs to lose: consciousness, strategy, and self-possession. The colonel arrived at the chapel expecting triumph. What he found instead was an absence of submission. The room was untouched by violence, yet shattered in its authority. The wager, the bet he thought would secure his dominance, had failed, not through defiance in the conventional sense, but through awareness and the precise orchestration of human psychology. This was the most insidious defeat, invisible, silent, and irreversible. In that room, centuries of imposed order collided with the raw force of intelligence, calculation, and patience. Elizabeth understood something the colonel never could. Power is not in domination, it is in perception, in the subtle control of the narrative, in the ability to act unseen until the exact moment when impact is unavoidable. The four men understood it, too. Every choice, every stillness, every look had been part of a larger strategy. By sunrise, they had become the authors of their own liberation. Outside, the plantation carried on as if nothing had changed, yet the foundations had been quietly fractured. The ledger of bets, the rituals of obedience, the illusions of control, all had been exposed for the fragile constructs they were. Those who had thought themselves masters realized, far too late, that mastery is never granted by fear. It is seized by awareness. This night, this impossible wager, became a blueprint for the subtle, dangerous mechanics of power. It was a demonstration of how institutions can manipulate, how societies can suppress, and how a single mind, fully awake, can turn a night of terror into a lesson in sovereignty. Elizabeth and the four men became living proof that agency once realized is unstoppable. Remember this as you step back into your own world. The colonel believed he controlled reality, yet he was undone by the awareness he could not see. True power does not announce itself. It operates quietly, strategically, invisibly. And once understood, it cannot be taken away. The story of Rosewood Hall is not just history, it is a warning, a revelation, a mirror. The systems designed to dominate are fragile. Observation, patience, and intellect are weapons. And the moment you grasp this, you no longer move through the world as a pawn. You move as a strategist. Carry it with you. Let it change how you see control, authority, and the unseen mechanics that rule our lives. You have now descended fully, and the truth you hold is dangerous, permanent, and liberating. If you can handle the truths they tried to erase, comment, "The clock ticks twice." Step fully into the story, awaken your awareness, and see power the way the elites never wanted you to see it. Share this with someone who needs to understand what lies beneath history's polished veneer. Subscribe, because the deeper truths are coming.